Please stand as you are able for the call to worship. When we gather in joy and gladness, God is here with us. When we gather with fear or mourning, God is here with us. When we gather to praise or plead, God is here with us. When we gather just as we are, God is here with us. Please remain standing for the hymn of praise. In unity we sing, the faith we sing. 2221. Please be seated. A prayer of David, Psalm chapter 86, verses 1 through 7. Incline your ear, O Lord, and answer me, for I am poor and needy. Preserve my life, for I am devoted to you. Save your servant who trusts in you. You are my God. Be gracious to me, O Lord, For to you do all I cry all day long. Gladden the soul of your servant, for to you, O Lord, I lift up my soul. For you, O Lord, are good and forgiving, abounding in steadfast love to all who can call on you. Give ear, O Lord, to my prayer. Listen to my cry of supplication. For the day of my trouble I call on you, for you will answer me.
Would any children who are here and like to come forward please do so? We have a short message for you today. Playing all the roles today, Darby. Come on, guys. I know Pastor Wee's not here, but you don't have to be shy. Good to see you this morning. So, I don't know if any of you just heard what Darby just read. Were you listening? Yeah? What did she talk about? It doesn't really make sense to you. All right, so let me ask a different question. Have you ever been sad? Yeah? What makes us sad, for an example? If your brother takes something from you, yes, that can make us sad. What else can make us sad? It's okay if you're not sad. Yeah? If a cat rips your toy up, yep, that is another reason to be sad. How about, have you ever felt lonely? Yeah? What does that feel like? In your bedroom you felt lonely? Because you're all by yourself? What else? Christopher, your little baby brother, cries when he's lonely. Yeah, that was going to be my next question. What do we do when we're sad or lonely? One thing we do is we cry, right? Any other things? That's pretty much the big one. That's what came to my mind. And actually what Darby just read is a cry. So when you cry, who do you cry to? Yeah. Your brothers? No, who do you cry to? Who do you ask for when you cry? Yeah? Cousins? Maybe your parents sometimes, right? Who do you think adults cry to when they're sad and lonely? Yeah? Their children sometimes, that's right. Kids can comfort adults. Who else? And other grown-ups? Yeah? God, right. Do you think kids can cry to God too when they're sad and lonely? Right. But so what Darby read for us is a really, really, really old cry from someone who was sad and lonely. In fact, what she read was from the book of Psalms. Have you ever heard of that? Did you know the Bible has many, many books inside it, not just one? Yeah? So there's this one book called Psalms, and I would call this book the book of all feelings. Because every feeling you can ever imagine, if you're joyful, if you're sad, if you're lonely, if you're really thankful, all of those feelings are found, written by adults a long, long, long time ago. And so we take a lot of comfort in that when we feel sad and lonely, we're not the first ones to have felt that way. And that when we're sad and lonely, we can cry to whom? Who do we cry to? God, yeah, and others as well, but including God. So today, let's just give thanks that God knows all of the ways that we feel when we're sad and lonely or when we're happy, and that God knows and hears us exactly where we are, just the way we feel. Will you pray with me? God, we thank you for giving us the Bible that is full of many books, and books that are full of many feelings, so that we know however we're feeling, we can find our way to you. We ask that you be with us and our families and friends and all of the people that we cry out to. We thank you for them and ask that you be with us in our moments of sadness and loneliness. We ask all this in the name of Jesus, who taught us to pray together, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, If you are 6 years old or younger, you may go downstairs, and if you're older or have other responsibilities in worship today, you can go back to your seat. And let's all stand and share the peace of Christ with one another.
This is a scripture reading from Genesis chapter 21, verses 8 through 21. The child grew and was weaned, as Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, who she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac." The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. For it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. As the son of this slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because of he is your offspring. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. As she departed, she wandered about the wilderness of Beersheba. But when water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite of a good way off, about a distance of a bow shot, for she said, Do not let me look on the death of this child. As she sat opposite him, she lifted her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of this boy, and the angel of God called Hagar from heaven, and said to her, What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him. Then God opened her eyes and saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. God is still speaking.
This morning's text from Genesis is not a warm, fuzzy one. Perhaps you've noticed that there are quite a few of those not so warm and fuzzy texts in the Bible, and they're not even exclusively in the Old Testament. Had I chosen the gospel lesson from today's lectionary, we'd be hearing Jesus say that he came to bring not peace but a sword, to divide man from father, set woman against her mother. So in some ways, it's slim pickings today for a lectionary preacher. But of course, the texts that trouble us are the ones that deserve our attention. And it's interesting that often what troubles us about these texts is that they are just so stinking human. we expect the Bible to be lifting up paragons of human existence, moral and ethical examples to follow, evidence that the power of God is with the righteous. And that's in there for sure. But there's a lot else in there too. Because as we know, not all of human existence is smooth sailing. And thanks be to God that our ancient forebears and those who wrote about them saw fit to include more than a few messy moments in these pages. Because while it can be nice to have a bar to reach for, there are other times where it's enough to know what not to do. But the story before us today is even more complicated than a simple cautionary tale. It's a rather tragic, if not altogether hopeless account of a group of sojourners who are up against some steep odds as they make their home in a new land. So let's do a brief recap of how we got to this point in the story that Darby read today. When Abraham, Father Abraham, is 75 years old, he hears a call from God to leave the land where his family is and set out for an unknown land of Canaan. Abraham agrees, and with his wife Sarah, who is also up there in years, they make this 500-mile journey to an unknown land where other people are already living. This 500-mile journey gets a whole 9 verses in Genesis and seems to have been largely uneventful. But no sooner do they get there that there's a famine in the land, forcing Abraham and Sarah to go to Egypt to get food, which is just another few hundred miles away by foot, of course. When they arrive, Abraham then essentially gives Sarah, his wife, to the Pharaoh as his wife in order to avoid trouble while in Egypt. Now, eventually, Pharaoh gets wind of the whole deal and sends them packing. But in the meantime, Abraham has made more than a small living for himself, let's say. And Sarah comes away with her maidservant Hagar, who serves in their household. Sometime later, as we know, God speaks again to Abraham, promising him descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. But after years of barrenness, a desperate Sarah tells Abraham that he should go on and take Hagar as his wife and try to produce an heir through her. Sarah's idea goes much according to plan, which turns out to be unfortunate for Sarah, who begins to feel that Hagar no longer respects her, but is, quote, looking upon her with contempt, a crime apparently worth a punishment so severe that the pregnant Hagar runs away into the desert. God sends an angel into the wilderness to comfort Hagar, promises her that her son, too, will be one of a great many descendants, and tells Hagar to return to Abraham and Sarah, which she does, and her son Ishmael is born when Abraham is a young 86. Life goes on back at camp. Sarah remains barren for a while. Some more angels visit and prophesy that, yes, in fact, she will bear a son. There's another incident where Abraham tries to give Sarah to yet another king, only this time the king figures it out and nothing happens. And then finally, some years later, Sarah becomes pregnant, gives birth to her son Isaac when Abraham is now 100 years old, at least in Bible years. Now, I hope you'll not accuse me of blasphemy when I say that there is not a whole lot of saintly behavior happening in this story. Abraham may be a righteous man of God on some days, but on other days, he's sending his wife off to appease kings, which ultimately contributes to his own economic prosperity. And Sarah, I think our hearts have to break for her a bit. She's barren. She's followed her husband on more than one and arduous journey across the desert. And of course, there's this whole thing with the kings. So perhaps it's not a surprise, and it is certainly not an excuse either, that in response, she dishes out some of what she's been given to poor Hagar. And Hagar, as a slave, she has no say in what happens to her life or her body. And if looking upon Sarah with contempt is the worst of her reaction, then there may in fact be a saint in this story after all. And all of this mess, this hurt, this pain, this confusion, all of it is stemming from their attempts, or at least Abraham and Sarah's attempts, to respond to a call from God. Yikes. Now, I'm in the ordination process, as many of you know, and from the start of this process, we are trained to be able to convey our call story in 3 to 5 minutes because any committee you go before is going to ask for it. And I have to wonder what Abraham would do in one of those settings. I can just hear the committee chair saying, okay, so Abraham, you got a call from God to take your family to a new land, and then you did what now? You had your wife do what exactly? The call itself was apparently abundantly clear to Abraham. He oriented his entire life around it, disrupted his typical way of being, brought others along for one significant journey after another. He was committed to staying the course. But Abraham and Sarah, they're also keen on surviving, which is no small thing to be concerned about, given the pioneer band that they are on the Canaanite frontier. So when an heir didn't come, or when they entered unknown, potentially dangerous territory, Abraham and Sarah just took matters into their own hands. Because after all, what good is a call from God if you're not around or your people aren't around to fulfill it? Now, of course, it's easy for us to pass judgment on Abraham and Sarah. We've got a few thousand years of chronological and cultural separation. But it is also right to name that the treatment of women in this passage is really not acceptable, not by our modern standards, and even not by ancient standards, as some of the surrounding text belies. No way am I trying to excuse or suggest we should follow their behavior. What I do observe here, however, what does seem mighty relevant for us, is that there is somewhere between receiving a call or feeling led or empowered to do some bold new thing, and then actually implementing that call, where we have a tendency to trip up. We begin to focus on what we deem necessary for our own survival, maybe our own prosperity, and we lose confidence that the call itself is capable of guiding us through the struggles of everyday existence. Now, I can already hear the skeptics in the room. Okay, Jen, that's interesting, but I've never heard a very radical call from God, or really not much of a call at all, so I'm going to check out. Okay, I get that the language of call, even in the church, isn't for everyone. But if you've ever felt just a little excitement, or maybe a better example is a combination of like a full heart and an upset stomach at the prospect of doing something new, maybe something a little unfamiliar, then you're not very far from where Abraham and Sarah and Hagar begin. Maybe it was a move, just like them, a relocation far from family or place of origin. Maybe it was our decision to choose a profession outside of what was expected of us or what we even expected of ourselves. And then there are those truly monumental callings, like being true and open about who we are and who we love, or to admit that addiction has got the better of us or of someone we love and to reach out for help and a fresh start, or leaving people behind if they're not good for us, even when we love them. Or hardest of all, choosing to love and not resent those people who have made our lives so exceedingly difficult. Hearing these callings, making these decisions, that's no small thing. But as anyone who has made one of these decisions will tell you, saying yes to the calling is only the beginning. Sure, there might be some profound freedom and liberation at the initial decision to chart that new course. But the implementation, that gets us almost every time. Who has ever moved to a new place without feeling sad or lonely? or stepped seamlessly into a new career trajectory or a new family, a new relationship? Who, after making a decision to be honest about a struggle or about one's identity, has never occasionally stepped back from that honesty because there was a moment where it just wasn't quite so easy? Even when the calling is clear, carrying it out is another story, and the devil is certainly in those details. But there was actually good news in our text today. Even when Sarah wants Hagar thrown out, even when Abraham complies, even when Hagar despairs and abandons her son in the wilderness, God keeps God's promises. The same promises even that God made when that call was first given. It's interesting that the story, and therefore our attention thus far, has been focused on the dynamics between Abraham and Sarah and Hagar. But amidst their struggles for survival and blessing, two new people have arrived on the scene. We've heard precious little about them, but God has been paying attention. Ishmael, Hagar's son, who at this point is actually a teenager in Bible years, if we do the math, is left abandoned by his mother. And the narration turns to focus on Hagar's weeping and her despair. But when the angel comes to Hagar to reaffirm God's promise, it's not on account of Hagar's crying, it's on account of Ishmael's. "What troubles you, Hagar?" the angel says. "Don't be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hands, for I will make a great nation of him." God heard the voice of the boy where he is. God heard the voice of the boy we didn't even know was crying. The voice of the boy who was born when his father misconstrued a call and carried out a plan that led to all manner of family strife. God heard the voice of this boy, born to a woman with precious little choice in her life, and who is despairing because even her child is about to be taken from her. This boy, who we might have called a supporting character, an unintended outcome, and Lord knows history has called him worse. This boy, Ishmael, is the one who gets God's attention. And not only does God hear him, but God keeps the promise that was made to Abraham's offspring, that his children, including Ishmael, would be the ones from whom God makes great nations. God doesn't renege on the promise, even when the humans got their hands and their survival instincts and their misinterpretations on it. God is faithful, even and especially to this boy, who we might say arrived by accident. And that is very good news for us as we stumble around trying to figure out our pathways forward. If it feels like we're taking one step forward in faith and two steps backward in fear or hurt or despair, God is there. God is actually quite familiar with that situation and has been since Ancient of Days. And God will even go so far as to step right into that place where we really misheard, or we really mistook, or we really misstepped, and even use that moment to turn us around. I have a colleague in the church, a United Methodist pastor, who has become one of the most vocal supporters of LGBT rights in the church. As we know, our policies discriminate against LGBT people, and clergy can face official complaints and even church trials for either being gay or presiding over same-sex unions. It's one of the reasons it was so important for us to become a reconciling congregation last year. And the role of this public advocate within the church is a critical one. My friend has become just that, She has a deeply kind and generous spirit and is also a phenomenal and powerful preacher. She's been invited to speak at national events. She's been that voice in the wilderness crying for justice. She's done a lot of work at the cross sections of racial justice and LGBT equality and public health. She's been interviewed by the media. She's like no small deal, but beloved in her church, in her community, and even far beyond. And you know how she got there? When she was in seminary, or shortly thereafter, she was approached by some friends, a gay couple, who asked her to preside over their wedding. And she said no. She wasn't ordained at the time, and she knew that it was at great risk to her process to perform a same-sex wedding. That could put her on the radar, jeopardize her chances of getting through her Board of Ordained Ministry exams. And she was not wrong in that fear. But that moment where she said no to being the pastor her friends asked her to be, that moment didn't let her go. And God didn't let her go. Not in that moment, and not in the many moments and choices that followed. She vowed, never again will I refuse to put myself at risk when the risks my LGBT siblings are facing are so much greater. And she has been humble and vulnerable enough to tell this story. And it has changed her life and her ministry in drastic ways. We don't get the call right every time. We just won't. But the good news is, God is willing to work with what we've got. That's not an excuse to be less courageous, but it is encouragement to step forward in faith, to put aside fear for survival or sustenance or prosperity even, and to live into the bold things that at least I believe God is calling all of us to do. And in the end, Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, Ishmael, Isaac, they aren't remembered for their folly, at least not right off the bat. They're remembered as the patriarchs and matriarchs of 3 major world religions. It's a divided family, an imperfect family, a family still capable of doing a lot of harm to one another. But it is also a family that listens to improbable callings, a family that celebrates God's faithfulness to God's promises, a family that on its best days is learning to pay attention to the ones that are often overlooked, a family that God hears right where we are. That's why we call ourselves children of Abraham and Sarah, Hagar. Because even in the places where we're at our worst, even when we totally botch the implementation of God's call, God is faithful and ever calling us to a life of promise. And for that we say, thanks be to God. Let us stand and sing.